Imagine this. Your 12-year-old autistic daughter is outside, peacefully practicing violin. Suddenly, the HOA president stomps over like she's auditioning for Mean Girls Retirement Edition, clipboard in hand, demanding silence. And when the violin doesn't stop, she calls the cops. Cute, right? Except there's one tiny detail she didn't know. Dad's a U.S. Marshal. Yeah, this isn't just HOA drama. This is an HOA going full kamikaze on the wrong family. Picture this. A quiet Saturday morning in Maple Ridge Estates. The sun's just peeking through, birds are chirping, and on one porch sits Emma, a 12-year-old autistic girl with her violin tucked gently under her chin. For her, it's not just an instrument, it's therapy, healing, and her late mother's legacy. Every note she plays is like stitching back pieces of her broken world. And honestly, it's beautiful. But not everyone thought so. Cue Deborah, the HOA president with more entitlement than a toddler in a toy aisle. To Emma, music was a lifeline. She'd been through trauma no child should face. After losing her mom, the violin became her anchor. Every squeak, every imperfect note wasn't noise, it was growth. And by the way, she wasn't even playing outside of permitted hours. Local ordinances gave leeway for practice during the day, and she stuck to it. But to Deborah, it was disruptive screeching. Yes, those were her exact words, scribbled on a complaint note like she was auditioning for the role of villain number 1 in a Disney movie. This wasn't a case of someone blasting dubstep at 2 a.m. This was a child practicing a violin during daylight. But Deborah, armed with her holy clipboard of HOA righteousness, decided it was unacceptable. And let's be real. Some people crave control like oxygen. They can't relax unless they're micromanaging someone else's life. Deborah saw Emma's violin as a chance to flex her HOA muscles, to remind the neighborhood who was really in charge. Spoiler? It wasn't her. What makes this even worse? Emma's autism meant the violin wasn't just practice, it was therapy. Studies show music helps autistic children regulate emotions, build focus, and communicate in ways words sometimes fail. But Deborah didn't care. In her world, property values mattered more than people. She wasn't hearing a child heal, she was hearing an inconvenience. And if this sounds extreme, that's because it was. Who hears a violin and thinks, time to start a war? Deborah, apparently. Instead of celebrating the fact that one of their community's kids had made it into the youth orchestra, she treated it like a crime. Because nothing screams community pride like stomping on a child's dreams with $100 fines. This was the spark that lit the fire. A little girl, a violin, and a woman with a clipboard who mistook power for purpose. And while Emma just wanted to play music, Deborah was orchestrating something far uglier. An HOA campaign that would soon spiral out of control. But Deborah wasn't content with just a nasty note. Nope, she was about to turn that clipboard into a weapon, and the family was about to find out just how far she'd go. Enter fact number 2, the rise of the clipboard crusader. Deborah didn't just complain once and move on. Oh no, she saw Emma's violin as her Everest, her great crusade, and she was climbing it one fine at a time. Imagine a woman in a navy blue blazer, in the middle of summer, mind you, marching across perfectly trimmed lawns like she's leading an army. Clipboard in hand, pen poised like a sword, she looked less like an HOA president and more like a dictator running drills. Her first move? Fines. She slapped the Thompsons with $100 for disturbance. And here's the kicker. The so-called disturbance happened during legal noise hours. In other words, Emma's violin wasn't breaking any laws, just Deborah's patience. But Deborah didn't care about facts. She cared about control. And in the HOA world, control comes in the form of paperwork, threats, and fines that double like rabbits. Every time Emma played, another letter showed up. This is your warning. Pay $200. Next week, $400. She treated the violin like it was a chainsaw roaring at midnight. She twisted the rules, stretched the bylaws, and basically created noise ordinances out of thin air. It wasn't about volume. It wasn't about property values. It was about ego. Because what's the point of being HOA president if you can't boss people around, right? And let's talk about optics. This wasn't a teenager throwing ragers with bass speakers. This was a child practicing classical music, the same kind of thing rich suburbanites pay good money to hear at symphonies. Imagine Beethoven rolling in his grave screaming, "She fined a kid for practicing my stuff?" Deborah's crusade wasn't just ridiculous, it was insulting to common sense. But here's the really wild part. Deborah seemed to enjoy it. Neighbors whispered that she was obsessed, jotting down times when Emma played, lurking near the property line with her clipboard like some kind of noise vigilante. It wasn't enforcement, it was harassment dressed up as neighborhood care. And each fine wasn't just money, it was a psychological blow. She wanted the Thompsons scared, compliant, and quiet. Too bad she picked the wrong family. Because James Thompson, Emma's dad, wasn't about to let some HOA president bully his daughter. He stayed calm, collected, letting Deborah pile up her threats, because what she didn't know was that every fine, every note, every warning was building a case against her. And James, he had the patience of a man who knew his day would come. But before James made his move, Deborah crossed another line. Literally, she wasn't just writing fines anymore. She was stepping onto property that wasn't hers. And when the cameras caught her, that's when things went from absurd to downright creepy. Welcome to fact number 3.
At first, Deborah's war plan was all about paper. Warning letters, escalating fines, and threats written in bold print like they were decrees from Mount Olympus. But when the Thompsons didn't crumble under the weight of her stationery supplies, she decided to upgrade her strategy. Forget the clipboard. Deborah was about to go full stealth mode, or at least her version of it. Enter trespassing. Here's the setup. James Thompson, already suspicious, installs security cameras around the property. And why not? After all, strange things were happening. Emma's music stand mysteriously knocked over, her sheet music found crumpled on the ground. At first, James thought maybe the wind or the neighborhood kids were messing around. But when it happened again and again, he knew something was up. And the cameras did not disappoint. Who did they catch slinking around the property like a bargain bin detective? None other than Deborah herself. There she was in all her glory, HOA president, self-declared guardian of neighborhood harmony, caught on tape creeping around someone else's yard. Not knocking, not asking, not checking in politely, sneaking, like a raccoon, only less charming. Deborah's excuse when confronted was even better than the footage. She claimed she was exercising inspection rights as HOA president. Inspection rights, as if she'd been deputized by the federal government to ensure no child played Chopin too enthusiastically. Sorry, Deb, but unless you've got a warrant in one hand and a badge in the other, wandering onto private property is just trespassing with extra paperwork. And let's be real, the optics were horrendous. Imagine explaining to your neighbors, "Yeah, I was creeping around a grieving child's yard at night, but don't worry, it was for the community." That's not protecting property values. That's straight up creepy. If there were a reality show called When HOAs Go Too Far, Deborah would have been the pilot episode. But here's the kicker. This wasn't just about violating property lines. For Emma, it was terrifying. She was already dealing with enough grief, autism challenges, and now the weight of her passion being turned into a battleground. And then she learns the same woman who calls her music screeching is sneaking into her yard. That's not enforcement, that's harassment. And harassment with a side of intimidation. James, of course, wasn't just annoyed. He was building a case. Every clip of Deborah sneaking around went into a growing folder of evidence, because James wasn't the type to explode in the moment. No, he was the type to wait, watch, and strike when the timing was perfect. Like a chess master, he let Deborah dig her own hole, one trespassing step at a time. But Deborah didn't realize she was already setting herself up for disaster. She thought she was proving a point. In reality, she was proving to the entire neighborhood that she'd crossed from HOA president to suburban stalker. And just when you think the trespassing couldn't get any creepier, Deborah decided it was time to bring in reinforcements. Not lawyers, not bylaws. Nope, she dialed the cops on a 12-year-old. Welcome to fact number 5. If there's a handbook titled How to Lose the Neighborhood's Respect in 10 Easy Steps, Deborah had just reached the chapter called Weaponize the Police. Because apparently clipboard fines and midnight trespassing weren't enough. Her next brilliant move? Calling the cops on a child. Picture this. Emma's outside again, violin tucked under her chin, bow gliding across strings. It's not perfect, but it's hers. A sound of resilience, of trying to heal through music. And then mid-song, flashing red and blue lights reflect off the windows. Sirens silence the melody. 2 police cruisers pull up to the curb, and neighbors peek through their blinds whispering. All because Deborah called in a welfare check. Let's decode that. Deborah told police a child might be in distress. Translation, this kid's violin hurts my ears, please bring armed officers to make it stop. It's the kind of petty overreach that makes you wonder if Deborah thought she was starring in her own Law & Order spinoff. Except here, the only crime scene was her ego. The cops, to their credit, weren't buying it. One officer reportedly rolled his eyes when he realized what was happening. He even mentioned his nephew was autistic and played drums. If I called the cops every time he practiced, the officer joked, we'd have SWAT living in the garage. Deborah didn't get the laugh she was hoping for. But the damage was done. For Emma, seeing cops at her door wasn't a quirky misunderstanding. It was terrifying. Imagine being 12, already carrying the weight of loss, already navigating a world that often misunderstands autism, and now seeing flashing lights because your therapy was mistaken for criminal activity. It planted fear where there should have been joy. The violin, once her sanctuary, was now tied to flashing lights and neighborly hostility. James was livid, though he stayed calm on the surface, because underneath his composure, he was storing it all away. The complaint notes, the trespassing footage, and now the police report. Deborah had just escalated from neighborhood nuisance to someone abusing emergency resources. And worse, she was targeting a child. That's the kind of move that doesn't just look bad, it blows up in your face. And blow up it did. Neighbors started murmuring, wait, she called the cops on Emma for practicing violin? Even people who had once stayed neutral began questioning Deborah's judgment. Because while HOA boards are infamous for pettiness, dragging the police into a child's therapy session crossed a line. It wasn't just ridiculous, it was cruel. And cruel wasn't even the end of it, because Deborah wasn't satisfied with flashing lights and warnings. She wanted punishment, real punishment, which meant fines, liens, and even eviction threats. And that's exactly where fact number 5 storms in.
By this point, Deborah had already written complaint notes like they were love letters to her own authority. She'd trespassed like a nosy raccoon with a clipboard. She'd even dialed up the cops on a child with a violin. But was she finished? Oh no. Deborah decided it was time to unleash the HOA's ultimate weapon: money. Or, more specifically, fines that multiplied like rabbits in springtime. It started small. One letter slapped the Thompsons with a $100 penalty for nuisance noise, which, let's be clear, wasn't noise at all. It was legal, permitted, and documented as perfectly within county noise ordinance hours. But Deborah wasn't aiming for truth, she was aiming for pressure. Her strategy was simple: stack the fines high enough and maybe James and Emma would fold under the weight. Except the fines didn't stop. They escalated. $200. Then $400. Pretty soon the bill ballooned to $1,200 for what? For a child practicing violin on her own porch in her own home during lawful hours. Deborah wasn't protecting community peace. She was running an extortion racket with stationery. And she didn't stop at fines. Oh no. Deborah escalated to a lien. For anyone lucky enough to have never tangled with an HOA lien, here's the translation. It's the HOA's version of holding your house hostage. If you don't pay, they can tack the lien to your property title, making it nearly impossible to refinance, sell, or even live in peace. In some cases, if it spirals, they can even push for foreclosure. Over a violin. Let that sink in. The absurdity here is staggering. Picture Emma, 12 years old, autistic, still reeling from the loss of her mom, finally finding joy in music. And her family getting eviction threats because one woman with the clipboard didn't like Bach echoing across the cul-de-sac? That's not just petty, that's cruelty wearing a polo shirt. James knew it too. He wasn't just angry for himself, he was furious for his daughter. Every time Emma saw another threatening letter, her confidence wavered. She started associating her violin, her therapy, her healing with punishment. And that was the true crime here. It wasn't about the money. It was about the attempt to break a child's spirit under the weight of fake authority. But here's where the tide began to turn, because Deborah, in her arrogance, assumed James was just another homeowner, someone she could bully into paying, someone who'd fold under the pressure of stacked fines and scary legal jargon. She had no idea who she was dealing with. And when she finally found out, the shock would be sweeter than any symphony Emma could play. Because James wasn't just a dad fighting for his daughter. He was something else, something Deborah never saw coming, a U.S. Marshal. And when he decided to reveal that fact, it wasn't just a plot twist. It was the moment the HOA's empire of nonsense began to collapse. Welcome to fact number 6. Up until now, Deborah had been playing the role of suburban tyrant with unmatched confidence. She had her clipboard, her fines, her threats, and her smug belief that no one could stop her. But what she didn't realize was that the man she was bullying wasn't just some mild-mannered suburban dad. James Thompson was a U.S. Marshal with 15 years of service under his belt. That's right, the guy she was fighting for, Noise, was a federal lawman who had stared down gang leaders, fugitives, and organized criminals. And she thought she was scary because she chaired an HOA meeting once a month? Please. He had stayed quiet about it at first. He wanted to protect Emma without adding drama. But after $1,200 in fines, a lien threat, trespassing, and cops at his door, it was time to put the cards on the table. And when he finally revealed his badge, oh, the silence in that HOA meeting must have been deafening. Picture the scene. A crowded HOA boardroom, neighbors packed in folding chairs, Deborah at the head of the table ready to gloat about the latest lien notice. James walks in calmly, folder under his arm, Emma by his side. He lets the board ramble through their accusations, their citations, their bogus claims. Then slowly he sets the folder down, pulls out his badge, and places it on the table. He says, "I'm a U.S. Marshal." And just like that, the atmosphere shifts. The board's smug expressions falter. Deborah's clipboard suddenly feels very, very small. Because here's the thing. You can bully the average homeowner with fines and jargon, but you can't bully a federal officer who knows the law better than you ever will. And James didn't just flash the badge for show. He brought receipts. He laid out evidence like a prosecutor at trial. Decibel readings proving Emma's violin never violated ordinances, neighbor statements confirming no one else complained, security footage showing Deborah trespassing, and finally, the stack of fines that had ballooned into a lien based on false pretenses and harassment. The reveal wasn't just dramatic, it was devastating. Deborah realized in that moment that she hadn't just picked a fight with a grieving dad, she'd picked a fight with the law. And in the HOA world where intimidation is everything, that kind of power flip is like pulling the rug out from under a magician mid-trick. James didn't shout, he didn't threaten, he didn't need to. His calm presence, his badge, and his mountain of evidence said it all. The HOA's fake authority crumbled in the face of actual authority. And Deborah? She was left with nothing but a clipboard and a reputation circling the drain. But here's the best part. James didn't just stop with the badge reveal. He had evidence to drop, like bombs, one after another. And when he unloaded it, the HOA's paper fortress burned to the ground. That's where fact number 7 comes in.
If the badge reveal was the thunder, the evidence was the lightning that struck the HOA straight in its bloated ego. James didn't just walk into that meeting with his title as a U.S. Marshal. He came prepared like a man who'd spent years building airtight cases against criminals far scarier than Deborah with her clipboard. And when he opened his folder, it was game over. First came the decibel readings, cold, hard data collected on Emma's violin practice sessions. Numbers don't lie, and those numbers proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Emma's music was well within the legal noise limits set by the county. Not once, not ever, had she broken ordinance. James had charts, logs, even time-stamped recordings. In a world where HOAs thrive on vague language, this was devastating. Deborah's disruptive screeching suddenly looked more like peaceful music floating under legal limits. Next, James laid out signed statements from neighbors. Actual neighbors, not Deborah's echo chamber. These statements confirmed Emma's violin was not an issue. In fact, some neighbors said they found it calming, even enjoyable to hear her play. One woman even wrote, "It's better than the sound of leaf blowers every Saturday morning." Ouch. That was a direct hit because every HOA knows leaf blowers are the real enemy of suburban peace. Then came the pièce de résistance, video evidence. The security camera footage showing Deborah creeping onto their property like a suburban cat burglar. There she was, zoomed in crystal clear, snooping, knocking over Emma's music stand, poking around like she was starring in CSI Cul-de-sac. When James played that footage on a laptop for the whole board to see, you could practically hear the collective gasp. Deborah's face went pale. Her inspection rights excuse crumbled in front of the very people she claimed to represent. And he wasn't finished. James stacked the bogus fine notices on the table like a dealer stacking cards, each one an example of harassment, each one dated, documented, and backed by law, showing how baseless they were. By the time he was done, Deborah's entire campaign of intimidation looked less like leadership and more like a personal vendetta against a child. The board was silent. The room was heavy with awkwardness, the kind where you can hear someone's throat clear 3 rows back. And James, calm as ever, letting the evidence speak louder than any rant could. This was a man who didn't need theatrics. He had the truth, and the truth was brutal. But just when you thought the evidence alone would have shut Deborah down, she decided to go out in a blaze of bad decisions. Her last desperate move? Projecting creepy photos of Emma and pushing for eviction. And that train wreck brings us straight in to fact number 8.
The HOA meeting after James revealed his badge and bombshell evidence should have been the end. A normal person would have admitted defeat, maybe even resigned with a shred of dignity left. But Deborah wasn't normal. She was powered by pure stubbornness and a dangerous cocktail of arrogance and paranoia. So instead of backing down, she doubled down, spectacularly. The meltdown began when Deborah pulled out a projector. Yes, a projector, because apparently she thought this was her big moment, her HOA State of the Union. She clicked through slides like a villain with a PowerPoint addiction, only instead of community budgets or landscaping plans, she projected photographs of Emma practicing violin. Creepy, zoomed-in photos, clearly taken without permission. The room went cold. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Whispering started. Because while it was one thing to complain about noise, it was another to stalk a 12-year-old and plaster her image on a wall in front of strangers. It wasn't just inappropriate, it was disturbing. You could almost hear the collective thought, "Deborah, what on earth are you doing?" And then came the pièce de la résistance of Deborah's meltdown, her push for eviction. She actually argued with a straight face that Emma's violin was so disruptive, so damaging to the community that the Thompsons should be removed from their home, evicted, over practicing during the day. If absurdity were an Olympic sport, Deborah just won gold. But James was ready. He didn't shout, he didn't slam the table. He simply stood, placed his hand on Emma's shoulder, and explained. He told the room about autism, about how music was Emma's therapy, her outlet, her way of processing the world. He reminded them that the law, specifically the Americans with Disabilities Act and Fair Housing Act, protected Emma's right to reasonable accommodation. And then he dropped the mic moment. "I'm a U.S. Marshal, and what you're doing isn't just cruel, it's illegal." The room erupted. Some neighbors clapped. Others glared at Deborah. The tide had shifted completely. What once might have been her kingdom of compliance was now a courtroom of public opinion, and she was losing badly. Deborah tried to argue back, but it was over. She looked like a villain caught in the act, desperate and shrill, and the more she talked, the worse it got. By the end of the meeting, she wasn't the confident HOA president anymore. She was the woman who stalked a child and tried to evict a U.S. Marshal's family over violin practice.
And if you think this was the end of Deborah's nightmare, oh no. Because James wasn't just defending his daughter in a meeting. He was about to take this fight to the federal level, and that's where the real consequences came crashing down in fact number 9.
Deborah probably thought the HOA meeting was the peak of her humiliation, but little did she know, James wasn't just there to clear his name and defend his daughter. He was there to set a precedent, to turn this HOA circus into a federal case, literally. Because when you pick on a child with autism and you weaponize the HOA handbook like it's the US Constitution, you're not just a bad neighbor, you're a violator of federal law. Let's break it down. The Fair Housing Act, or FHA, and the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, are clear. You can't discriminate against someone because of their disability. You can't deny them accommodations that let them live a normal life. And Emma's violin practice? That wasn't just a hobby. It was therapy, supported by her doctors, her teachers, and her father. By calling it noise, fining the family, trespassing, and pushing for eviction, Deborah had essentially built herself a case file of violations. And James knew exactly how to file it. This wasn't his first rodeo. As a U.S. Marshal, paperwork and federal processes were second nature. He filed formal complaints against the HOA and against Deborah personally. These weren't empty threats. These were filings that triggered real investigations. Suddenly, Deborah wasn't just facing angry neighbors and a fractured board, she was facing the federal government. But wait, it gets juicier. Remember those creepy photos she projected of Emma practicing? Yeah, that went into the complaint too, because let's be honest, nothing screams harassment like secretly photographing a child and using it to argue for eviction. If the fines and trespassing didn't sink her, that sure did. Neighbors, once fearful of HOA retaliation, started siding with James openly. She called the cops on a child, they muttered at barbecues. She stalked a grieving family. Word spread fast, and suddenly Deborah wasn't the queen of Maple Ridge Estates anymore. She was the neighborhood pariah. Parents whispered warnings about her to their kids. Some residents even started campaigning for her removal before the feds could finish the job. And here's the kicker, financial mismanagement. While digging into the HOA's accounts, James uncovered irregularities. Deborah had been skimming funds. Oh yes, the clipboard queen who preached community responsibility had her hand in the cookie jar. And when the auditors confirmed it, that was checkmate. Deborah wasn't just a petty tyrant, she was a petty tyrant with sticky fingers. Now imagine her downfall, from strutting around with her blazer and clipboard to facing federal complaints, possible charges, and the wrath of the very people she once intimidated. The same neighbors who once looked the other way when she nitpicked mailbox paint were now sharpening their pitchforks. The HOA board fractured beyond repair, and Deborah was at the center of a legal hurricane. And while Deborah's empire was crumbling, the Thompsons were rising stronger than ever. Because for Emma, this wasn't just about winning a legal fight, it was about reclaiming her voice, her music, and her future. That's where Fact 10 comes in, the sweet symphonic victory. If this story were a symphony, then Fact 10 is the triumphant finale, violins soaring, drums pounding, and the audience on their feet. Because in the end, Emma and James didn't just survive the HOA's harassment, they thrived. And the sound of victory was sweeter than any gavel hitting would. First, the practical wins. The fines? Gone. The lien? Erased. The threats? Null and void. Every bogus piece of paper Deborah had thrown at them was shredded by the force of law and common sense. For James, this wasn't just relief, it was vindication. For Emma, it meant that she could finally pick up her violin without fear of flashing lights or creepy neighbors with cameras. But it didn't stop there. The neighborhood rallied around the Thompsons. Inspired by Emma's resilience, they turned what had been a battleground into something beautiful. A community garden was built, doubling as a performance space. Emma played there for the first time with neighbors gathered, clapping, smiling, the same people who once peeked nervously from their blinds when the cops pulled up. Now they were cheering for her. That's not just healing, that's transformation. And what about James? Well, let's just say irony has a wicked sense of humor. The same man who was once threatened with liens and eviction, he was voted onto the HOA board, not because he wanted it, but because the neighbors trusted him. They'd seen his patience, his strength, his refusal to be bullied. They knew if anyone could keep future Debs in check, it was him. And James, reluctant at first, accepted, because if there's one thing better than beating the system, it's fixing it from the inside. And as for Deborah, her reign ended not with applause, but with disgrace. Removed from her position, investigated for financial mismanagement, and shunned by her neighbors, she faded from the cul-de-sac spotlight. No more clipboards, no more fines, no more strutting across lawns like she owned them. She was just another name whispered about in neighborhood lore.
the president who called the cops on a child and lost everything. And Emma? She blossomed. The violin became her symbol of resilience. She didn't just keep playing, she started teaching other kids, turning her therapy into inspiration. Every note was proof that she couldn't be silenced, not by grief, not by autism, and definitely not by an HOA president with too much free time. This was more than a personal victory. It was a message. To every HOA board member drunk on power, you can push people, but push too far and you'll collapse on your own arrogance. To every family intimidated by fake authority, the law is on your side. And to every Emma out there, quietly practicing, quietly healing, your voice matters and it deserves to be heard. So, the next time an HOA thinks they can silence a child's dreams, maybe they should remember Maple Ridge Estates, where a violin and a U.S. Marshal composed a symphony of justice. If that story hit you right in the feels and also made you want to ban clipboards forever, smash that like button, subscribe to HOA Wars, and ring the bell so you never miss another saga of suburban chaos. And tell me in the comments, what's the wildest HOA story you've ever heard? Bonus points if it's pettier than finding a kid for Bach.